Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I am Michael Braithwaite, one of your hosts, and as always, I am joined by the wonderfully talented Stefania from CAEH. Steph, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing today?
Good. You know what? Lots going on, and that just means progress is being made, and that's where we want to go. Lots of exciting things we saw today at Blue Door. It was a big day, so we have a construction social enterprise. Right, and that's been going for about a year. It's been going really, really well because it prevents homelessness by giving people meaningful and well-paying jobs. It also brings in revenue and builds housing, right? So it's pretty cool. So it received the Ontario Non-for-Profit Association Innovation Award this year. So they just launched a video with that. So it's been a big day for Blue Door. How about you? What's going on at the Alliance?
Well, that's amazing and congratulations. I really think that's so exciting. I love the work that you guys do at Blue Door. For the CAH, I think right now we're just really focusing, Parliament's back in and our lobbying efforts are back at it. And, I think we're looking to see what the conference will look like next year, the National Conference on Ending Homelessness. So, I think we'll be releasing details early in the new year, but just planning because it's hard to predict where we're going to be in a year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that. And as we record this, we're only 4 days away from two major milestones. One, my birthday. Two, it's National Housing Day. On November 22nd. So that will be interesting to hear. I believe the throne speech comes from that, and we'll see the mandate letters. So always great to get the Canadian Alliance's take on all of that for sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of takes, I'm really interested in today's guest who comes from, sort of my neck of the woods, but also super not really. So can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, much more sunny, I believe, and a little more rainier. But listen, and all the way from Los Angeles, we have Charley Ligety. Charley is a published author, serial entrepreneur, former licensed real estate agent, and commercial real estate banker. He's the director of the Housing Innovation Collaborative, the HICo, an action-oriented nonprofit housing R&D platform based in Los Angeles. HICo highlights the next generation of construction, finance, and policy solutions to address the housing affordability crisis. His recent work on rapid shelter solutions has been featured in national press and published with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Charley earned his Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College, majoring in geography and economics, then an MBA from the University of Southern California. Charley, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you for having me, Michael, and thank you for having me, Stefano.
Well, so we've got into the habit of always having our first questions center around home, because that's what this podcast really is all about. So I'm going to ask you, what does home mean to you?
Wow, it's such a simple question with so many connotations. I kind of even just reading my bio, it's sort of like I've always been involved in some sort of home development, home industry business. Both my parents were residential real estate agents, so I grew up going to open houses and, kind of talking about people buying their new home and sort of the real estate aspect my whole life. But I really had a kind of a new meaning to home when I got out of the bubble of, the resort town that I grew up in and moved to Los Angeles and saw how much more important home is to where you kind of end up in life. And so I think home is your starting point. It's where everyone comes from. So, and that's sort of like whether you wake up in the morning and you sort of are a younger person in a better neighborhood, waking up in a big house, you're going to probably be better off in this country or this world than someone that's waking up in a sort of dilapidated home or in an apartment building that their parents can barely afford in a different neighborhood. So it's sort of everybody's starting off point is that's housing is where we come from.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been loving this question because I just find everyone has such a personal answer and they vary. But I think there's that commonality of it's home, right? Which is why it is a simple question, but it's interesting how varied the answers have been. And, it's so exciting to have somebody from LA. This is really, I think our first guest, or it's been a long time since we've had a guest south of the border. So what can you tell us about the Housing Innovation Collaborative? How did it come about and what does it aim to accomplish?
Well, yeah, so the Housing Innovation Collaborative, it's a nonprofit. It was founded in 2017 in Los Angeles, really by a group of stakeholders in the affordable housing and homelessness services and industry here in Los Angeles that sort of saw this the continued worsening of our homelessness, unhoused population kind of growing every single year by double digits for the past 10 years. And so a lot of stakeholders involved in the industry that build affordable housing or part of the social services network here in Los Angeles, we're like, we have to create some way for us to come together, share best practices, and start coming up with solutions that can actually start being sort of scalable in addressing this issue that seems to be out of control. So in Los Angeles, we house about half of California's unsheltered population. So of the 150,000 people that sleep outside every night in the streets in California, 75,000 of them live in the LA region. So we're sort of the nation's epicenter of the, I would say, unsheltered population. Across the entire country, we have the largest unsheltered population. And, it's sort of gotten to a point where people now see homelessness everywhere. It's sort of like it's gotten to the point where there's not a single neighborhood in LA spared, not a single mile of freeway spared, of tents kind of popping up everywhere. And so I think it's very much in people's faces now of the inequalities that we've sort of built into the society over many, many years. So sort of to the point where the housing crisis isn't just a problem for the lowest income people anymore. It's a problem for, all the way up to the middle class, where now the median sales price of a home last month, just in LA County, was $800,000, which is almost 3 times as much as what the median household income in our county can afford. So something is going on where the supply is simply just not keeping up with all the people that want to work here, all of the demand. And so, kind of the Housing Innovation Collaborative's sole task is kind of creating this platform to share best practices and how we can actually scale this problem. So we're looking purely at supply production, innovation, where it drives down the cost, sort of accelerates the timeline, or improves the outcomes or design of the product. And so we're sort of showcasing innovations in sort of the design space and financing, sort of what new banking or lending practices can help save money, and in the zoning and land use, but also in the construction process and sort of looking at various modular construction processes out there. What's happening in the 3D printing space. Honestly looking at what is possible that we can kind of put and deploy right now to actually scale this problem. Because right now in Los Angeles, the problem is really a supply and demand problem where there's not enough money to go around to solve this homelessness, housing crisis at the lowest income with the methods that we have right now. So in LA County, we have this sort of famous number, $550,000, $600,000. It now costs per unit to provide permanent supportive housing in our city. It's sort of the butt joke of a lot of late night TV shows because they are here in LA, part of this kind of like local development challenge where it costs so much money to build 1 unit of housing. And so, at that rate, that's kind of the whole point of the collaborative, is to showcase how can we provide supply at a much lower price point, kind of along the entire continuum of where we lack supply. There's a supply deficit both on the lowest income side of the housing industry, and there's a huge supply deficit for the sort of the middle income, moderate income household industry. And so we're just trying to simply figure out how we can hack at that huge deficit that we need to tackle in order to really address the crisis at the root cause, which is not enough homes.
Mm-hmm. So you sort of touch on this, my next question about what the state of homelessness and the housing crisis is like in LA. And it sounds very familiar to what's even happening up here in Vancouver, where there is, it does cost a lot to develop in Vancouver. And of course that gets translated down to the consumer level. So I guess, you said you moved to LA. I just wonder what that evolution has been like for you in the time that you've lived there. From like, how long has it been that you've noticed this sort of modern mass homelessness where it's in, every neighborhood?
So homelessness in LA has been kind of tied connotations of that for decades. We've like sort of since the 80s or even before that, we've had a pretty large population down in downtown LA, Skid Row, which has always been sort of where LA kind of shoved the problem aside for the past several decades, is they just sort of said, let's take all of these encampments and just force them into this like one sanctioned box out of sight, in sort of a corner of a vacant part of town, a bunch of warehouses in sort of the fashion district, arts district type of area. And so that has always been around. The difference though is that the numbers they've doubled in the past 5 years. And it's gone from an embarrassing problem to kind of like, you just can't, you can't ignore it anymore. Like you're literally walking, I walk out of my house, walking around tents on the sidewalk. Just a couple weeks ago, we had, LA Times journalists locked up like it was, we were in Russia or something, because we deployed riot police to clear an encampment out of a neighborhood. We're like literally dragging, kicking and screaming people into buses to eradicate this problem. And so, we're at a whole another level of like this kind of continued, we've tried to deal with the problem by ignoring it. That hasn't worked. And so I feel like it's starting to now become a trend of kind of changing the psyche in LA of like, oh, we actually have to figure out how to address this thing. Oh, you can't kick this can down the road, and the buck stops here too. So like we have to figure out how to address the problem, because it's only going to get worse. And I think that's kind of the tipping point that we've been at over the past maybe 2 or 3 years. And that's why LA passed, a $1.2 billion bond initiative back in 2017 or 2018, or maybe it was 2016, sort of in the past 4 years. That's why LA passed this huge bond initiative to build specifically housing for people experiencing homelessness, because it had been such a in-your-face issue now. You can't go to work without stepping over someone sleeping on the streets. So it's like I feel like that is where we are now in LA, and I feel like that's the kind of the tipping point of when you can kind of get cataclysmic change, is when you have sort of the public support behind something, and the urgency seems to be started ramping up.
For sure. And I think let's talk about change. A lot of change comes from innovation. Your organization, I think, looks at innovation and solutions to ending homelessness. And can you tell us about some of the cool innovations you've seen? What's working?
Well, The problem with the housing supply that's creating sort of a homelessness issue and also a housing affordability issue for the middle class is we don't have enough housing options, and we don't have enough homes long term. But we also do not know as a society really to deploy housing now, sort of as an emergency measure. And so when we were right at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, LA just finished our homelessness count. We had 70,000 people living outside on the streets. And now we have this acute public health nightmare where literally every person sleeping outside on the street could die from coronavirus. And so in the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was this huge sense of urgency to bring people inside, whatever it took. And we were buying motels. We were renting, all these hotels that sort of were vacant. I think California across the state maybe rented 7,500 hotel rooms to bring people inside. And so, there was this kind of huge surge of unsolicited proposals to help. And so that's what we, as a website, kind of evolved to create this sort of Housing World's Fair, is we created sort of a standardized submission process where, we could sort through and catalog all of these different unsolicited proposals that were coming into the LA mayor's office to solve this acute sort of nightmare scenario of needing to shelter people quickly and immediately. And so we sort of wanted to capture that innovation in a bottle, but then kind of grow that into a bigger kind of catalog discussing how do we as a society deploy housing in times of crisis more effectively. It's a broken system right now. And so I think there's a lot of interesting solutions out there that we've kind of taken in from other realms outside of the housing sort of crisis or housing industry realm, from the military or from FEMA response to disasters or refugee innovations that the UN is deploying in sub-Saharan Africa, to figure out what are pieces or lessons learned from other types of similar scenarios where there's a homelessness crisis in Jordan, because Syrian refugees have been flooding into that country for the past 10 years, where you have these massive encampments throughout the country. And so they're thinking about the exact same issues that LA officials are thinking about. And I think that is kind of the knowledge sharing that has been the most interesting, is looking at how the housing is deployed. And so we've showcased these panels that have someone from the mayor's office who is maybe involved in deploying rapid shelter in their city, pop-up tiny villages or huge tents or something within weeks after the crisis, to sort of showcase how deals got done in various scenarios. And so I think it's that's the most interesting innovation, is providing the full picture of how action can take place. It's not just showing off a sexy model housing unit. It's here is the structure that you follow to basically put together one of these deals. You got to find a place to put it. Here's a church licensing agreement that you can use as a template from the Seattle model to secure a piece of land. You have to find the vendor, obviously, for the housing model based on whatever budget you have. You have to put together the development team. You have to have an operator, and there's basically 5 parts of every sort of deal. And so I think showcasing that of how do you take all the innovation of sort of the interesting housing models and actually plug them into your city. And so you sort of showcase the collaboration of a church group, a social services provider, a developer, a city staff member at the mayor's office. Basically took 5 people to pull this thing off, to bring the rest of the coalition in to actually deploy a deal. And so I think that's those are the most interesting innovations, because they basically say, if these 5 people can sort of deploy housing in that manner, given that budget, and sort of here's the pieces that go into it, what is the excuse that no other city is doing. It's sort of like we're showcasing what 3% of the cities are doing. But what about the other 97%? What are their excuses for not doing action too? And so we kind of make it a very replicable thing where people can just learn from and copy each other.
Yeah, I mean, in Canada, we often refer to it as a demonstration project or a pilot project, and we do that for, hey, let's build it small, see if we can scale it. But also, people are sometimes more likely to fund it because the risk is not as high. We're talking about the here and now. There's lots of work to be done. Let's talk about the future. What are some of your goals for the future? What are your hopes?
That there's more collaboration in the housing industry. I mean, kind of, it's like, so the Housing Innovation Collaborative, like our mission is building more housing. It's basically our name. It's building more housing with more innovative sort of methods of deploying that housing with more partners. More people and more ideas need to come together to build housing. That's how housing is built. And I feel like we have tons of capacity, like all the hardware and software is in place to build housing right now. We have trillions of dollars of dry capital. We have the technology, the labor force to build housing. We have the land to build housing. We have the money. What we don't have yet is the willpower to do that. And so I hope in the future there's more like real collaboration around achieving shared goals. So like right now, I feel like where we are as a housing industry and addressing this is everybody's acting in their own thing. They're all doing their own thing. No one's coordinating their initiatives. And that's both from, all the different government agencies working on the homelessness and housing crisis in Los Angeles and just across the country. That also goes for all these different architecture studios, that have their own little innovation labs and and it goes for even just the industry groups that have these like round tables where there's still closed door meetings that you have to pay, $100 to hear what people have to say on a panel. And it just becomes just an echo chamber of, people in the same industry sort of saying the same things about the problems out there. And I feel like we need to start talking less about distribution and more about contribution. And so I hope that people start like really actually collaborating with each other. And like our platform tests that every day of how collaborative any organization is. Because, our team will reach out and say, will you like to participate for free for an initiative? Whether it's showcasing a design, showcasing a book that they wrote, or an article or a report or whatever, and sort of gauging their willingness to share that, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of people are just like, more than willing or come unsolicited to share proposals or advice or contacts or whatever. But I feel like there's still a lot of people out there that are just sort of hesitant to open themselves up to just sort of like taking a swing at new ways of thinking. Like right now for fun, we're proposing to build the first floating apartment in the port of Long Beach in Los Angeles with these urban rigor floating apartments that they have a bunch of in Copenhagen. Not because it's like the best solution ever for the homelessness crisis, but really because one, it is feasible, so we should be exploring it. Why not? And two, it's a good way to get, like, basically call up a county official, right, and say, hey, I have this idea about floating housing, just to get rattle them out of their comfort zone of now having to respond to a question about how to authorize the entitlements and building code around a floating apartment. And that's simply what we need to be doing. People need to be getting out of their comfort zone, because right now the status quo is what everyone's comfort zone is. And to change how we address the housing crisis means you have to change how you feel and how you act on any given day. Like on a Tuesday morning, if someone emails you with a crazy idea, because I know people, like officials working in, the mayor's office in Los Angeles, for example, because they forward me these emails all the time, are, proposing, hey, I have this like pop-up shelter thing, right? The emails, those emails never go responded. But what if people started responding to them, right? Because then the vendor could get some feedback. The city would end up getting better results. And, sort of like taking the crazy step of responding to the crazy sounding person over email or whatever is a good first step to figuring out how you can get out of your comfort zone and start collaborating with each other more. And I feel like that isn't really, right now, the status quo is very much locked up walls still, at least in my perspective from LA. But I'm sure everything's more collaborative in Canada. But
well,
in the US, it's still, that's where I hope the future goes.
I like to think it's it's more collaborative. And listener, if you're not watching the video, I've got my, just to prove I'm Canadian Charlie, feed into the stereotype, I've got my Tim Hortons.
Oh my God, yeah, that's great.
Look at that. Yeah. There you go. I'm one lumberjacket away from feeding into that stereotype. You're absolutely right. We need more people like you. We need to shake it up.
Poutine in the front, poutine on the side.
It's fine. I just had it for lunch. It was delicious in the snowbank.
Poutine in the middle of the day. I couldn't get anything done after eating poutine in the middle of the day.
So we love what you're saying. We got to shake it up. What we're doing isn't cutting it. We have to do things differently to prevent and end homelessness. Where can people go to find out more about what you're doing right now?
So our platform, this like Housing World's Fair, virtual Housing World's Fair, is housinginnovation.co. So short for collaborative. But if you just Google housing innovation, I think we have #1 SEO on that. So that's also a way to find us. But that platform is kind of a self-exploratory, series of exhibitions where you can walk through villages of emergency rapid shelter if you're a local government official. You can walk through, like sort of a whole catalog of backyard home designs that are pre-approved by cities or at the state level. Or you can, walk through different deals that cities have done. So we're trying to make sort of an educational experience that's also sort of just like you are visiting the zoo and happen now to know more about the animals that you see versus it being sort of like a classroom feel. So that's what we kind of hope is people kind of just stumble over various innovations out there, because at the end of the day, like that's how you see yourself plugging in, is like, oh, maybe I want to build a backyard home, or oh, maybe this organization sounds really interesting, or like, oh, maybe I should contact so and send this to them, or whatever. So I think that's kind of how people can get involved, just by engaging with it as they would just a normal average user.
Well, that sounds really interesting, and I definitely encourage our listeners to check that out. But Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for providing this forum for having these conversations. So that's always the most important step, is just creating the opportunity to take the step. So thank you.
Awareness and education, that's a large part of what On the Way Home is about. Steph, I love the energy. I love the challenge. Another great guest on the way home, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. And it was, interesting because it was reminding me how much Vancouver, in particular with our downtown east side and Skid Row, have in common, and that Skid Row actually got its name from the downtown east side origin story, which is, the downtown east side is based where the logging camps were, and that's where the SRO hotels, the single room occupancy hotels, came from, that are now, the SRO hotels that we know them as today. So Skid Row comes from that logging term, and then somehow made its way down to Los Angeles. And I had a journalist friend, who was very upset about that, and because it's like, Skid Row, it's a Vancouver term. But I think it just also touches on the commonalities that we experience in our cities when we see that level of homelessness on our streets.
So, you're dropping some knowledge there. I learned something. Well, I learned a lot today, even more right at the end when I wasn't expecting it. Probably not something are super proud to own, but
Yeah,
but
no.
nonetheless, it does come from Vancouver. Thanks for joining us on the way home. Steph, we'll see you next time.
See you then.